What if I told you that behind every pirate flag waving in the wind was a secret more disturbing than any buried treasure? That the real horror of piracy wasn't the violence or the theft, but what happened below deck, in silence, in shadows, and behind locked doors. From forced marriages mocked in front of drunken crews to boys dressed as women and kept as entertainment, pirates didn't just rule the seas, they created a floating empire of sexual terror. These weren't random crimes. They were rituals, systems, codes of power carved into human flesh. And the worst part, some of these practices were so grotesque they were scrubbed from history until now. The year was 1661. A merchant vessel bound for Lisbon was seized by pirates off the Barbary coast. Among the captives was a 19-year-old noblewoman, barely a week into her marriage. Her husband had been executed the moment the pirates stormed the ship, shot in the head and tossed overboard like garbage. But she was spared, not out of mercy, but because she had a different purpose. The pirates dragged her to the deck, tore the white satin gown from her body, and tied her, barefoot, half naked, to the mainmast for everyone to see. The crew of the merchant ship, now shackled and bloodied, were forced to watch. So were the women and children. The pirates weren't just making a spectacle, they were performing a ritual. One meant to erase dignity, status, and civilization in a single act. The captain declared her the ship's new Bride of the Sea, a title that sounded ceremonial, but meant one thing: she now belonged to all of them. What followed was not a frenzy, it was organized, controlled, deliberate, a brutal display of ownership masked as tradition. Each pirate, one by one, walked past her, touching her face, her body, marking her like a sacred object. They made sure her eyes never closed, that she remained conscious, that the screams never stopped. This wasn't just about lust, it was psychological warfare, a message to every prisoner on board. There is no protection, no God, no rank that will save you here. Only the code of the black flag. The bride's body became a stage, and her humiliation, the Pirates' Anthem. This was piracy, not the fantasy of rum and treasure, but a floating system of terror where sexual violence wasn't a crime, it was a language. And this was just the beginning. On a pirate ship, consent was a concept that never existed. Women weren't passengers. They were plunder. As soon as a vessel was seized, the pirates moved swiftly. The gold and cargo were taken first. Then came the women. Labeled as prizes, they were paraded before the crew, stripped of names, dignity, and humanity. Some were raffled off like spoils of war. Others were claimed outright by senior officers. There was no negotiation, no voice, no escape. Resistance wasn't tolerated, it was punished. Women who cried, screamed, or fought back were dragged before the crew and made examples. Humiliation was public and intentional. One French account tells of a woman sewn into a pig carcass and thrown overboard for refusing a pirate's demands. Others were branded with hot irons to mark ownership. Smiling wasn't optional, it was enforced. A downturned face could result in a flogging, or worse. Some pirates drew up crude contracts, written in blood or ink, assigning women to specific crew members for set periods. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month. These were not relationships. They were sentences. The women were forced to clean, cook, and submit, often under threat of mutilation or death. When the contract ended, they were passed on to the next man, their bodies treated like shifts on a work schedule. To the pirates, this wasn't cruelty, it was routine, just another part of life at sea. Their code didn't recognize morality, only power. A woman's value was based solely on appearance and obedience. The moment she stepped aboard, she ceased to be a person and became property. And if she wanted to survive, she learned fast. Resistance was fatal, and compliance was demanded with a smile. On the high seas, the black flag didn't just mean no mercy. It meant no choice. On pirate ships, some women weren't simply used, they were wed. Not by love or law, but by mock ceremony, carried out under torchlight with a laughing, drunken crew as witnesses. These weren't marriages, they were performances of dominance. The pirate captain would declare the woman his bride, drape a stolen veil over her shoulders, and raise a cup of rum in celebration. Sometimes the woman was branded with a hot iron, others were tattooed, scarred, or forced to wear jewelry that marked her as owned. There was no escape. Once claimed, she was paraded through port cities like Tortuga or Nassau, displayed as a possession, not a partner. Locals were told she was his wife, but behind closed doors, she was anything but. She endured daily rituals of submission, expected to cook, clean, entertain, and satisfy. Her refusal was never an option. Her body was a guarantee of loyalty from her husband, who used her to prove status among other pirates. These ceremonies had no legal weight, but their consequences were brutally real. The moment a woman was married to a pirate, her life was erased. She couldn't go back to her family, if she had any left. Society wouldn't take her back. She was defiled in the eyes of her culture and enslaved in the eyes of the lawless. The pirates called it protection. They said it gave her special status. But the truth was simpler. It was a prison with a wedding ring. The title of wife meant only that one man, not many, had exclusive rights to her suffering. It was control masquerading as ceremony. And for the women forced into these roles, it wasn't matrimony. It was a lifetime sentence without a shore in sight. History remembers pirates as rum-soaked rebels, but beneath the surface lies a horror too disturbing for most legends. Young boys, captured during raids or abducted from coastal villages, were often brought aboard not as prisoners, but as playthings. They were small, vulnerable, and easily controlled, and that made them targets. These boys were assigned as cabin attendants, a title that masked the truth. They were expected to serve food, clean quarters, and run messages. But behind locked doors and beneath creaking decks, the expectations went further. Many were groomed slowly, given extra food, attention, false praise, until the moment the illusion shattered and the abuse began. Some pirates didn't bother with subtlety. Boys were forced to wear women's clothing, their hair styled to appear feminine, their names changed. Pirate codes, like those found in the Caribbean and West African waters, reference youths kept for pleasure, a chilling phrase hiding systematic exploitation. In some cases, these boys were passed between crew members or reserved for officers as a grotesque form of entertainment. There was no rescue, no witness, no one to speak for them, and the silence wasn't accidental, it was enforced. Boys who resisted were beaten, tossed overboard, or mutilated. Survivors learned quickly that obedience meant survival, and silence meant safety. Some lived this way for years, aging into the very system that had devoured them. This part of pirate history was buried for centuries. Only fragments remain in court testimonies, in whispered confessions before executions, in the haunted pages of lost ship logs. Few historians have dared to name it. Fewer still have studied it, but the truth is there, waiting. Pirates didn't just loot cities, they shattered childhoods. And for every treasure map we've ever found, there are hundreds of stolen lives buried in the silence. Pirate ships had no kings, no thrones, but they had power, and that power was often enforced not with gold or titles, but with flesh. Below deck, dominance wasn't just about commanding raids or dividing loot. It was measured by who could control whom sexually. The rules were simple. The strong took, the weak obeyed. High-ranking pirates, the captain, the quartermaster, senior raiders, didn't just command the ship. They claimed bodies. Captives, boys, even lower-ranking crewmates were seen as part of their spoils. Compliance wasn't just expected, it was demanded. A smile could mean safety. A refusal could mean the sea. Sexual submission became currency. A young sailor who endured abuse might be spared hard labor. A captive who didn't fight back might avoid worse punishment. But any hint of rebellion, refusing to kneel, saying no to a senior pirate, could bring brutal consequences. Mutilation, beatings, or simply being tossed overboard in the night, never spoken of again. There were no laws, no protections. Power was fluid, but always brutal. Even relationships between pirates followed this twisted logic. A crewmate who once shared bread and laughter could become a predator with a single rise in rank. Sexual dominance wasn't questioned, it was proof of authority. And once someone had control, they didn't give it up. These weren't acts of passion, they were performances of power, designed to break will, test loyalty, and enforce hierarchy in a floating world with no borders. The ship became a prison, and sex became a sentence. Even those who survived physically were left hollow, stripped of dignity, autonomy, and trust. On land, people ruled with laws. But at sea, under the black flag, power was taken with violence and sealed with silence. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a hierarchy carved into skin. History loves to romanticize Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who dressed like men, fought like devils, and sailed under the black flag. But the truth behind their stories is far more brutal. They didn't just fight for adventure. They fought to survive in a world that saw women as objects, not equals. On pirate ships, a woman's body was currency, target, and weapon. To live, many had to learn how to seduce, deceive, and manipulate. Anne Bonny reportedly slept with multiple men aboard her ship, not for love, but leverage. Mary Read disguised herself as a man to avoid sexual violence, only revealing her identity when it served her. Seduction wasn't pleasure, it was armor. These women walked a razor-thin line. If they refused to play the game, they risked rape or death. If they played too well, they became pawns in larger power struggles. Some used their sexuality to climb the ranks, turning predators into protectors. Others wielded influence over terrified captives or humiliated rivals, weaponizing the very tool used against them, and in some cases, they crossed the line completely. There are accounts of female pirates participating in sexual punishments, directing assaults, mocking victims, even choosing which captives were spared or violated. They weren't always victims. Sometimes they became enforcers of the very system that had once threatened to destroy them. On land, women were silenced. At sea, they adapted. But the cost was immense. Behind every smirk and swagger was a story of survival wrapped in blood, lies, and trauma. Anne Bonny once said, "If you had fought like a man, you'd not be hanged like a dog." But the real fight wasn't on the deck with a sword. It was in the dark corners of a ship where power was traded in flesh. Pirate justice was swift, brutal, and often theatrical. When punishment was needed, it wasn't enough to beat or kill. The goal was to humiliate, to destroy not just the body, but the spirit, and nothing shattered a man faster than being stripped bare and broken in front of laughing eyes. Mutineers were the most common targets. A sailor who questioned orders or disobeyed commands might be dragged onto the main deck, stripped naked, and bound to the mast. There, he'd be mocked, violated, and spat on, his cries drowned out by drunken cheers. The message was clear: disobedience would be repaid with degradation. The body became a billboard for power. Slaves who resisted commands were sometimes punished the same way. Pirates believed shame was more permanent than pain. They used objects, cane poles, ropes, even gun barrels, to enforce submission. These acts weren't hidden. They were staged. Everyone was expected to watch. Participation was sometimes mandatory. Even captured enemies, naval officers, rival pirates, or merchants could be subjected to these displays. Stripped of their uniforms, forced to beg, made to kneel before men they once considered beneath them. The point wasn't satisfaction. It was erasure. Their authority, masculinity, and dignity were publicly burned away, and when rum flowed, these punishments turned into performance. Crews laughed, bet on how long a man would scream, danced around victims as if at a festival. In those moments, the line between justice and entertainment vanished. These weren't isolated events. They were rituals, unwritten laws that governed life beneath the black flag. Pirates didn't just rule with fear, they ruled with shame. Because pain fades, but the memory of hundreds of eyes watching your body break, that never leaves. And that was the true sentence handed out on the high seas. In pirate strongholds like Nassau and Tortuga, there were no kings, only coin, rum, and flesh. Brothels weren't just common. They were institutions, unregulated, violent, and deeply woven into pirate economics. These weren't places of pleasure. They were holding pens for human cargo, many of them girls who had never chosen to be there. Women were trafficked in and out with the same efficiency as rum or weapons. Some were bought outright. Others were rented for nights, weeks, or indefinitely. Many were enslaved or taken from colonized territories, their identities erased the moment they stepped onto the island. Pirates paid in silver, in promises, or with favors. A woman's body could clear a debt, it could seal a deal, it could buy a man's way onto a ship. Some brothels operated like recruitment centers. A fresh-faced youth seeking to join a crew might be handed a woman as a gift during his initiation. It wasn't kindness. It was a test of loyalty, of dominance, of the ability to consume without conscience. Those who refused were seen as weak. Those who accepted became part of the system. Madams ran these brothels with iron fists, but they too were trapped, often former captives who learned to survive by becoming gatekeepers. Any resistance was crushed. Escape was fantasy. Disease was rampant. Pregnancy offered no mercy, and if a woman tried to flee, her punishment would be public and final. The brothels didn't just feed ships, they fed the culture, one where power was measured in how many bodies you could own, break, or forget. Every port visit became another transaction, another wound, another soul erased for a coin and a drink. In pirate ports, sex wasn't sold. It was stolen, and no one came looking for what had been taken. Pregnancy aboard a pirate ship wasn't seen as life. It was seen as a curse. When a captive woman became pregnant, the crew didn't celebrate. They panicked. A growing belly meant responsibility, permanence, and moral weight, three things that had no place under the black flag. Pirates lived by no laws, answered to no one, and the idea of fatherhood threatened that chaos with something terrifying: consequence. For many, the solution was simple and brutal. Pregnant captives were often thrown overboard, their bodies swallowed by the sea before anyone could ask questions. Others were forced to abort using crude, violent methods: poison, beatings, starvation. No concern for the woman, no concern for the child, just the removal of a problem. Sometimes pirates abandoned them on uninhabited islands, dumping women like unwanted cargo with no supplies and no chance of survival. Their stories ended in silence, beneath the sun-bleached bones of forgotten coastlines. But not all pregnant captives were erased. Some were paraded like trophies. A woman with a swollen belly became proof of a pirate's dominance, his legacy carved into her body. She was marched through ports, mocked by other crew members, forced to serve while carrying the physical evidence of her captor's conquest. She wasn't treated with care. She was an exhibit, a living reminder of power. And when the child came, it belonged to no one. Born into limbo, too pirate for society, too human for the crew. Many died in infancy. Others were traded, sold, or left behind in brothels like coinless debts. In a world without rules, life didn't begin with birth. It began with usefulness. And if a pregnant woman couldn't serve a purpose, Her story ended before it ever had a chance to be told. Modern stories have painted pirates as mischievous outlaws, charming rogues with gold teeth and rum-soaked laughs. But the truth lies rotting beneath centuries of myth. Behind the eye patches and parrots was a world where sex was not an indulgence. It was a weapon, a tool of fear, a method of control. Pirates didn't just plunder ports. They plundered bodies, and they built a culture where domination, sexual, physical, psychological, was embedded in every act. Trial records from the 1600s speak in cold, legal language of unnatural acts and violent liberties taken with captives. Recovered journals hint at nights no one wanted to describe. Whispers from survivors speak of rituals too horrifying to publish. The truth was buried not because it was forgotten, but because it was unbearable. These weren't crimes of passion. They were structured systems of violence. Aboard every ship, there was a hierarchy enforced not just with swords, but with silence. Captives were assigned, traded, or discarded. Boys became property. Women were punished for smiling too little or crying too much. Sex wasn't intimate. It was strategic. And terror was a form of discipline. And yet the legends persist. Buried treasure, daring escapes, drunken duels. But the real treasure maps, the ones no one drew, lead to forgotten islands, shallow graves, and silent wrecks. Places where the X doesn't mark gold, but something far heavier. These stories aren't in history books. They live in the shadows, passed between old court files, cracked bones, and artifacts no museum displays. But they're real. And the legacy they left still echoes today in the myths we tell and the truths we avoid. Under the black flag, nothing was sacred. Not life, not love, not even memory. And some secrets, it seems, were never meant to be unearthed.